This is Westminster Hall, built by William II in 1089. That was the second attempt to get us into the common market. Julius Caesar first, William the Conqueror, and then Edward Heath. And in this hall, many important events have occurred. Considering that all the visitors who come here are told it is the Mother of Parliaments, it may be a surprise to discover it is a palace. And I am treated here on sufferance, like you, from Granada. And when we began this filming today, I was told I wasn't allowed to do this interview because it is a royal palace and the authority traces its way back through the Sergeant-at-Arms and the Lord Great Chamberlain to the Crown. And therefore, in a strange and vivid way, this little, illegal, unauthorized interview tells you all you need to know about the real powers within the Palace of Westminster, within the Mother of Parliaments, within the feudal system that we call in Britain a democracy.
Tony Benn has always been fascinated by political power. For 25 years, he has kept a daily diary. In it, he has charted and recorded what he sees as abuses of power by both Labour and Conservative governments. Tonight, using his personal records, Tony Benn gives us his view of how Britain is really governed.
The system is really very simple. Every night, when I get home, I take the day and the papers that go with it and dictate from notes made at meetings everything that's happened. So that when you come back to the diary itself as it's typed up, all the relevant documents are there. Then in addition to that, I will file speeches that have been made, personal papers, newspaper reports, political material, and so on. And of course the purpose of doing it is not because I'm a librarian with that interest or a historian, but because these are the working papers of an active political person.
In this basement, the diary is being transcribed and edited for publication in 4 yearly installments. Benn's records are a testament to his belief that Britain is not a proper democracy, but more the remnants of a feudal system, with power exercised in the name of the Crown. And behind most things, not the people, but prime ministers.
As we've got a bit of time spare.
Have you actually done...
He is the third generation of his family to serve as a member of Parliament. Keeping political records is also a family tradition.
An original idea to go...
A favourite part of the family collection is this film of Benn's father, Lord Stansgate, made by the BBC in 1958.
Now, I have all my life been a magpie. I've not only accumulated things that were of interest to me, but I have, side by side, made a careful study every day of the news. But in addition to that, I keep personal records of my own. Now, here, for example, I've got the Egyptian file, and I'm going to give you...
Like father, like son. As a minister, Tony Benn regularly dictated 2,000 words a day. The archive contains 350 sound cassettes, 100 rolls of archive film, 200 videos. Since 1963, he has kept records of every meeting, every important conversation, every speech.
If you're interested in what goes on, you have to look at some of the formal state occasions. 1981, I recorded the opening of Parliament, and it does really tell you a great deal about how the system works. And so perhaps I can do a conducted tour of the opening of Parliament. Now, here is the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh arriving in the Parliament chambers, it's called, to read the Queen's speech. The speech was written by the Prime Minister. The powers of the Prime Minister derive from the Crown. The Crown has certain powers residing about picking of a Prime Minister. So you get the interconnection between the formal occasion and all the glitter and glamour of it and the real exercise of powers that are themselves derived from from a feudal structure. The only person I ever took to see that or showed it to understood it was an African. He said, "Oh, I see, there's the chief on her stool. There are the wise men of the tribe, judges with long hair. There are the witch doctors, the bishops. There are the landowners wearing animal skins, that's the peers in ermine, and there are the common people petitioning for their rights." And that is what it's about. And so, in a nutshell, you do get a view once a year at the opening of Parliament of what, from the point of view of the public, is marvellous splendour, a great royal occasion. Actually, it's the one time you get the opportunity of understanding who does what and who runs who within what is a system very far removed in terms of its democratic practice from any other democratic country in the Western world.
Since Benn gave up his own peerage, he has been an outspoken critic of the British Constitution and favours the more open American system. Traditionalists disagree. The establishment view is explained by the former Lord Chancellor.
You've got to remember that human institutions are of two kinds. There is the traditional, like the papacy, where they use Latin in habemus papam, magnum gaudium vobis nuncio, habemus papam, Johannem Paulum secundum. I mean, a traditional system is one which works. If it doesn't work, it's abolished. It comes to an end. But it has the mystique and the cohesiveness which holds people together in a common loyalty. We happen to go on in Norman French occasionally, even to this day. But there is no, as it were, point in it. A contrived constitution, like the American Constitution, has to justify itself by reason. The trouble about that is that reason changes from century to century, and there are parts of the American Constitution which appear to me to be extremely archaic now after 200 years, and there are those factors in it which tend to make the Americans a nation of hypochondriacs and litigants.
Lord Hailsham himself, of course, is a constitutional phenomenon. He was Quintin Hogg MP. When his father died, he wanted to be Lord Hailsham MP. They wouldn't let him do it, so he became Lord Hailsham. When I renounced and made it possible, he came out again and became Mr. Quintin Hogg and was elected as an MP. Then he got fed up with the Commons and got a life peerage as Lord Hailsham. And I have a sort of feeling that the most secret part of our unwritten constitution is a general understanding that after every general election, Mr. Quintin Hogg or Lord Hailsham will tell Parliament which house he wishes to sit in, and on this basis he advises us all on how democratic the British Constitution really is.
Between 1964 and 79, Benn served as Postmaster General, then Minister of Technology and Power, then Industry, then Energy. His ministerial responsibilities brought him into contact with the Queen.
The power to dissolve Parliament, to cancel out the election completely and start with a new one, remembering elections have to take place after 5 years, but to do that before the 5 years is personal to the sovereign. Now, I had a couple of interesting discussions on this question, one with the Queen herself. I've got my diary here. July the 11th, 1969, she came to Winfrith, the reactor, and I had lunch with her. And I'm quoting now from my diary. Then we moved on to the subject of the royal prerogative. I asked her whether, when there was a dissolution contemplated, she ever consulted the Speaker, because he was impartial. She said, "I'm supposed to be impartial, but of course I can call in whom I like." So I asked her, well, suppose, for example, and this was a highly contemporary issue at the time, there had been a row on the industrial relations legislation in place of strife, and the Prime Minister had come and asked for a dissolution. It was at least arguable that another Prime Minister would have held together a government without a dissolution. Jim Callaghan would have been perfectly happy to pop into the palace if Wilson had resigned and say, "I've still got a majority." She said, well, we had to look up all the precedents on the dissolution. And I pointed out it might have well become real if the Parliamentary Labour Party had rejected an industrial relations bill. She referred to 1931, that was when Ramsay MacDonald defected, and said, of course, the national government was a similar case. when Ramsay MacDonald had asked for a dissolution, but nothing was ever quite the same, and nothing ever quite happened the same. And I think that was the nearest I ever got to the Crown personally interpreting the powers.
The monarch is still advised by members of the Privy Council, whose secret oath has not changed since the days of Queen Victoria.
To be a member of the Cabinet, you have to be a Privy Councillor. The only title that goes with that is the Right Honourable. A Privy Councillor has an oath administered to him. And when I went to Buckingham Palace in 1964 as Postmaster General, and I was shown for the first time the oath of a Privy Councillor, I candidly didn't want to have it. And somebody very nicely said to me, well, if you want to be a minister, you've got to do it. So I went through with it.
It's a very ancient oath. We are all pledged not to divulge it, although I think some newspaper did publish it some time ago, but it's, as far as I know, that's the only occasion on which it's ever been published. If you look at books on constitutional law, you'll see it doesn't appear there. But it's a very long oath. It's taken before the Queen, and it's binding for life, of course.
The oath of a Privy Councillor. You do swear by Almighty God to be a true and faithful servant unto the King's Majesty, this is the old version, as one of His Majesty's Privy Council. You will not know or understand of any manner of thing to be attempted, done, or spoken against His Majesty's person, honour, crown, or dignity royal, but you will let and withstand the same to the uttermost of your power, and either cause it to all matters committed and revealed unto you, or that shall be treated of secretly as a faithful and true servant ought to do to His Majesty. So help you God. Now, that oath interested me for a number of reasons. First of all, it was read to me, and I said at the end, well, I've done nothing. Oh, they said, we've administered the oath like an injection. Whatever you do, it has been administered, and that is the oath that binds you. Secondly, of course, it is the medieval Official Secrets Act. I mean, if I tell you anything that happened in the Cabinet, which is a committee of the Privy Council, I am guilty, I suppose, of the Peter Wright offence, only with all the gravity that goes with it. Second, it tells you you've got to sneak on your comrades. If somebody says something that you think might be damaging to the Crown personally, you've got to tell somebody else, and it will be dealt with. The whole thing reeks of a medieval authority, which is quite foreign to modern democratic practice.
Tony Benn first achieved national fame in 1960, when he fought a famous legal duel with the state.
I inherited, allegedly, a peerage when my dad died. He'd been a Labour MP, and at the end of his life he was made a peer. There were no life peers. He was made a hereditary peer. My elder brother was killed, and so in 1960, when I'd been in Parliament for 10 years, they threw me out on the grounds I was a peer. I was disqualified, got re-elected, was thrown out after the judge had said that a peerage was an incorporeal hereditament. That's a bit of real property in your body, affixed to the blood and annexed to the posterity. And it took a long time to get rid of it. And just before I renounced, I went to a hospital in Bristol, and I asked them to take a bit of blue blood out and put a bit of anticoagulant in it. So what you're witnessing here is a piece of blood of a peer of the realm. Now, that's just an idle curiosity, but then you work out what it's worth. And I checked recently with the House of Lords. If you include all their allowances, overnight, secretarial, subsistence, and so on, they're eligible to £100 a day. So I got out my calculator, and I'll do it again. £100 a day times 4 days a week, times 33 weeks in a year, times, say, 28 years that I would have been there. I've lost £369,600. £369,600 by renunciation. But the point is that those who didn't renounce are still getting it. And when you saw the Lords pouring in from all over the country to vote for the poll tax, which will enormously benefit them personally, the stately homes will pay nothing, at least no more than the little pensioner couples in Chesterfield, and you get this money for doing it, you realize what an extraordinary, primitive, barbaric system we still accept uncritically. And that is at the core, still, of the British parliamentary system. That is the body that can frustrate a Labour government. That is the body that can be relied upon to support a Tory government, whatever they do.
Well, there are a number of very important pieces of legislation that were held up by the House of Lords, and they kept sending them back to us. We had a position, particularly with the shipbuilding bill, where they held it up, and in the end, a whole important sector had to be eliminated. Otherwise, we'd have never got it through. But that wasn't the only one. There was a number of others as well, and it was quite clear that they mobilised their Tory majority in the House of Lords to stop genuine legislation which was in the Labour Party's manifesto. And that made us very angry, and so some of us said, right, the next time round we'll have to clearly come out against the House of Lords and carry out what the party's policy was in the past, argue for the abolition of the House of Lords.
The crunch came on the night of April the 2nd, 3rd, 1979, when a drafting committee, of which I was a member, met at number 10 Downing Street to consider the manifesto. And what happened, I recorded before I went to bed that night. I've got the tape, and this was recorded about at 3:15 in the morning, 3:45, I think, on the morning of April the 3rd, which happened to have been my birthday. And it's what I'm about to play was a report of what had happened an hour or two earlier at number 10 Downing Street.
Then we came to the question of the House of Lords, and I moved it, and I said I wanted to take this very seriously because this is a thing the party's said for a long time. It's been through the conference, it was unanimously accepted. The Lords hold back our legislation. There's an awful lot of patronage, and we should say that. Well, Jim said, I won't have it. I won't have it. So Eric lost his temper and banged the table. What do you mean you won't have it? Who are you to dictate? Who do you think you are? You're just a member of the party. And he banged the table. Jim said, well, I won't have it. So I said, well, you can't do that. He said, I can. I said, you can't do that. What are we to say to people who say we joined the Labour Party to have some influence on our parliamentary system? And we joined the party, we got it through, we've elected a Labour MP, and we wanted to implement our policy. What are you to say to him? You'll have to change the leader, said Jim. So I said, well, let's make it into personalities, not political issues at all. Jim said, I won't do it. He said, I'm the leader of the party. I have to decide what's right. I have responsibilities that I have to take. I won't do it. So in the end, we decided to leave it and put it on one side.
So that was the diary operating at its most effective, within an hour or two of it happening, putting it down from notes made at the meeting, and in a way summing up the whole problem of the attempt by successive party leaders to dominate the party, regardless of what the members decide to do at conference.
Although the Queen traditionally presides over the handing out of ceremonial honours, only a very few are in the personal gift of the monarch. The honours list itself is controlled by the Prime Minister of the day. Harold Wilson caused a storm with his resignation honours list in 1976.
Well, Wilson used it quite crudely. And I remember one clash with him just before he resigned, because on the National Executive Committee, this would be in about February 1976, I had resurrected a paper I'd written years ago about the honours system, in effect saying it should be abolished. And Wilson, of course, at that time, I think it was just before we knew he was going to resign, was preparing his dissolution or resignation honours list. And he was absolutely furious. He sent me a minute saying it was entirely a matter between himself and the Queen, and nobody had any power to intervene, whatever. So I wrote him a little note back, a manuscript note, which was one way of dealing with Prime Ministers on the warpath, saying, dear Harold, all I did was to bring forward a paper. And the officials, the top officials in Whitehall, regard the honours list as absolutely the peak of their power, and any interference with the recommendations they make cause them enormous anxiety, because you come up the scale from a CBE to a KBE to a GBE, and your class and standing depends upon how high up the ladder you've got. For example, in the Department of Industry, I once wanted to bring somebody in to advise me, and the Permanent Secretary said it was impossible. And I said, why not? And he said, well, he's a GBE, and I'm only a KBE. And he couldn't have somebody working who was one rung higher up the ladder than he was himself.
Of course, civil servants who are by and large not well paid compared with persons of the same degree of ability outside ought to work for the honour which public service ought to bring. And that is why they get honours. They don't all get honours, and they don't get it automatically. They're very carefully sifted. If you're dealing with a population of 66 million or thereabouts, they can't all get honours. No, it can't be a situation when dukes are two a penny.
There's one case always interests me very much in respect of the mass media. People talk about press lords. Well, they really are press lords. And if I look at Labour Prime Ministers, because I don't know how it works in the Conservative Party, though it must be similar, a press proprietor who supports the leader of the Labour Party, particularly against his rank and file, will be rewarded with a peerage. And so in the end, the Prime Minister manipulates the proprietors, and the proprietors then manipulate the news to benefit a Labour Prime Minister in dealing with his own conference or rank and file. We've seen that happen time and time and time again. It's one of those little deals. Cecil King asked me to lunch with him when I was Postmaster General. And after the lunch, or during the lunch, he said to me, you know, really, I ought to be given a peerage, and I might be made a minister, take perhaps the Board of Trade. And he had done a deal, there's no doubt, of a very ordinary kind with Harold Wilson. The Mirror would support Wilson, and then he expected something in return. And I said to him, in a rather jocular way, I said, you can have my peerage, I don't want it anymore. And he didn't think it was funny at all, and I don't think he ever quite forgave me. What I didn't know at the time was what has come out since, that in addition to being the man in charge of the Daily Mirror, Cecil King was evidently working for MI5.
Benn's records for 1974-75 suggest that MI5 was running out of control. Peter Wright's book, Spycatcher, confirmed this.
On page 31, Mr. Wright alleges, and I quote him, "We did have fun. For years we bugged and burgled our way across London at the state's behest, while pompous, bowler-hatted civil servants in Whitehall pretended to look the other way." End of quote.
I have not the slightest doubt that there was a concerted effort to destabilise the Labour government in general and Harold Wilson's position in particular. It was largely operated through the press, of course, 95% of which was hostile, and who did anything in their power to discredit not only Harold Wilson, but anybody who might be associated with him.
Well, there was a lot of evidence which I gathered, you know, not especially, but you noted it down at the time, which makes sense in the light of what was happening. I remember on one occasion, I think it was during the October 74 election, I had a telephone call from Wilson when I was in Bristol, asking about some parties that had occurred, I think at Bickenhall Mansions. I didn't know what he was talking about. Turns out, according to Peter Wright, that that was a place where they hoped to, in some way, involve and entrap people in order to embarrass them.
In July 74, I had a letter from Mr. Chapman Pincher, who was then the defence correspondent of the Daily Express, saying that they'd come into the hands of the newspaper what purported to be particulars of a bank account I held with the Swiss bank in Zurich. And it looked absolutely genuine. So I immediately got in touch with the Attorney General, and they got Scotland Yard to take the matter up at once. The branch of the bank, Swiss bank in London, wouldn't allow us to see the account, or wouldn't allow anybody to see it. But the bank in Zurich did agree to the Scotland Yard officers being shown this. So they went to Zurich, and they saw this and discovered that it was, in fact, the account of a Swiss couple who were very well known to the bank. And what the forgers had done was to delete their name and address and substitute my name and address. It was done extremely skillfully. But no sort of man in the street could obtain these documents anyhow, certainly not the bank's own particulars of the account. So it was coming from a very expert quarter. But when the Wright wrote his book, and Mr. Cavendish more recently, and Mr. Cavendish actually mentions my name, saying that there was a campaign to denigrate and to destabilize the Labour government, it seemed to me that this was the quarter it came from.
When I was Secretary of State for Energy at the end of '75, a vacancy occurred on the board of the British Gas. And I wanted to appoint Hugh Scanlon, who was then the president of the AU. And I had to discuss it, first of all, with my permanent secretary and also with the chairman and deputy chairman of British Gas. And it was very interesting, the response. I've got my diary here. The chairman of British Gas said, as far as Scanlon is concerned, I want to be sure the man we have is loyal to the country, as if he would in some way tell the enemy where the gas pipelines were. And my permanent secretary put in a note saying that, and I'm reading again, security would not allow Hugh Scanlon to see any documents of confidential rating, that's security rating or above, in effect saying he's a security risk. So here you had a big chairman of a public corporation and a permanent secretary vetoing one of the men who were leading a union which was a pillar of the Labour government. And later, when we came to other discussions as to who we should have, the gas people said, let's have the Duchess of Kent. Thought that she would be better qualified.
Because they were dominated by one obsession, and that is communism. Who was a communist, who wasn't a communist, who was coming more under the influence of King Street, who was coming less. Was Hughie Scanlon less under the control of the party? And I don't know what they were supposed to do to help me.
They used two ciphers, a low-grade one, which...
None of Wright's disclosures surprised Tony Benn. He had encountered the security services early in his career.
And a high-grade one, you're probably doing something illegal as well.
In 1946, when I was at college, I was approached by somebody who said he had a job that he thought I might be interested in, and he introduced me to somebody called Colonel Sheridan. And Colonel Sheridan said, there's a job you might be interested in. So I said, well, what is it? Well, he said, it's a sort of government job. So I said, well, as a matter of fact, I couldn't contemplate that because I would like very much to get into Parliament, and I knew enough about it to know that an office of profit under the Crown disqualified. Oh, he said that doesn't make any difference at all. So it was quite clear what it was, and I had a word with my dad about it, and he said, don't touch it with a barge pole. Now, it wasn't until later, after I was elected, that Colonel Sheridan came to see me, and it then turned out that he worked for, and I think had set up, the Information Research Department of the Foreign Office, which in effect is a security department. And in effect, he was saying you could be in the security services and a member of Parliament. You could have two parallel careers. And it wasn't later, until Colonel Sheridan died, that the full story came out. So in a way, a diary is helpful because it allows you to go back on earlier experiences and reassess them in the light of subsequent knowledge. And here was an attempt to get somebody who might be a member of Parliament to work for the security services in parallel. And I'm absolutely certain that that has happened in many other cases.
Ask some of Britain's wealthiest individuals where they keep their money,
and they may politely suggest that you mind your own business.
Whoa!
But it's probably a safe bet that the bulk of it's not kept in a building society. No, the heavy actions in stocks, shares, gold, property.
Unit trust from MIM Britannia, sir. They have investment schemes that start at just £25 a month.
Are you rich, then?
No, sir, but I intend to be.
MIM Britannia, unit trusts. Your piece of the action?
Gaggia made their first ever espresso coffee machine in the 1930s. By the late 1950s, Gaggia was an international craze. Today, you can have an authentic Gaggia in your home. Gaggia. Cappuccino? Espresso? Bellissimo.
The Invisible Man isn't worried about catching his flight. Federal Express has arrived in Europe, an air express package service he can trust, because when they say they'll deliver on time, they mean on time. Federal Express, when it absolutely, positively has to be there on time.
The Volvo 340, tested by dummies, driven by the intelligent.
I see you've got homework, too.
It never ends.
Looks like it was quite a project.
Have a look.
Thanks. Impressive. I wish we could do work like this. But we have to crank them out every week.
So do we.
But we can afford to farm them out. We have to do them on our computer.
So do we.
You did that on the computer? What kind of computer?
Come to Ascot this weekend and enjoy the thrills and excitement of this world-famous racecourse. Between races, go to the paddock to see the horses and jockeys. Take your pick of the many bars and restaurants, or just relax and enjoy yourself. Everyone's welcome at Ascot, and there's so much to do. Accompanied children under 16 are free, and there's a supervised playground for the youngsters. Admission is from £2.50 upwards, and access is easy with plenty of parking. So become part of the Ascot scene this weekend. Ascot, you can't beat being there.
In his 38 years as a Member of Parliament, Tony Benn has chronicled the behaviour of 9 different Prime Ministers.
The modern British Prime Minister is really a dictator. There's no leader in the world can do what a Prime Minister can do. They can hire and fire ministers at will without consulting anybody. They can appoint members of the House of Lords, who are members of Parliament, and in the last 40 years, I think nearly 800 people have been put in Parliament for life by the Prime Minister. Marvellous power, because people are queuing up to get a peerage, and they behave themselves very carefully in case they don't get one, and it's worth an awful lot of money. Then, of course, they can appoint the bishops. I'm the only country in the world, I think, with a Prime Minister who doesn't even have to be an Anglican, let alone a Christian, can appoint. You could have a Hindu Prime Minister who appointed the next Archbishop of Canterbury. There's nothing in the Constitution to prevent that. Appoints the judges and see they keep in line. Appoints the chairman of the BBC and the chairman of the IBA. Can, of course, go to war without consulting Parliament. You don't have to have any consent from Parliament to go to war. Can sign a treaty. Mrs. Thatcher, for example, didn't require a parliamentary vote in order to take us into the Falklands War. This Prime Minister has a reputation for being very tough. Of course, that's only possible because it would appear that members of the Cabinet are not prepared to stand up against her. But to be quite candid, Clement Attlee, whom I much admired, built the atomic bomb without telling the Cabinet or telling Parliament. Now, that was an abuse of the prerogative power, in my opinion, and I've often said it. He also invited the American bases to come here, telling people that it was only a training mission. Actually, American bases, in which 30,000 American troops and 130 bases now operate, began under Attlee without Parliament knowing. James Callaghan committed £1 billion to the updating of the Polaris without telling more than a handful of ministers, not the Cabinet or Parliament.
Benn's diaries show how Prime Ministers bend the system to their own advantage. On the 31st of October 1974, he described that day's Cabinet meeting.
Every Prime Minister is always worried about leaks, and we were lectured on a number of occasions by Wilson about leaks. One of the funniest occasions was in early one morning. Wilson began to lecture the Cabinet and said he would not accept it, he would not do it. And he went on so long about leaks, we never got onto the agenda. So we had to adjourn and come back after lunch. When we came back after lunch, or rather when we left the Cabinet in the morning, the Evening Standard had a headline, Wilson warns the Cabinet. Well, nobody had left the Cabinet. So we all came back with the paper and said, how did that get in the paper, if you're talking about leaks? And he said, I don't know. But of course, 99.9% of the leaks in British government are leaks by the Prime Minister through the press officer. Then it was Joe Haynes, now it's Bernard Ingham. And I had a number of very threatening letters from a succession of prime ministers about speeches I was making, which were held by the prime minister to be a breach of collective cabinet responsibility. I issued a minute to all my own ministers, saying to them that, in effect, we remained who we were when we were ministers. We had a duty to our conscience, to the party, to our constituents, as well as to the government. Then the final crunch came when, of course, Mrs. Thatcher put a question down to Prime Minister Callaghan, asking him about collective responsibility, and the then Prime Minister replied, collective responsibility applies when I say it applies, and it doesn't when I don't. But, of course, collective cabinet responsibility went far beyond that, because the Prime Minister would set up a committee of which you knew nothing, the membership of which was secret, and then you'd find something had been done which had a very profound impact on your work, and you were expected to be totally loyal to it without ever knowing.
There was one extraordinary incident which took place late in 1977 when a small cabinet subcommittee met under Jim Callaghan with the Permanent Secretary at the Treasury, the Governor of the Bank of England and the Chancellor of the Exchequer and a couple of other people present. They decided completely to change economic policy without telling the Cabinet, without telling Labour MPs, and effectively without even telling the country. They decided they'd drop the devaluation policy, they'd drop a policy of economic expansion, they'd move to a more monetarist policy, they'd have a much higher exchange rate, and they'd be prepared to risk higher unemployment. Now, nobody knew that that cabinet subcommittee had taken place, and I only found out by accident and then talked to one of the people who was present at it.
The most powerful department in the government, Her Majesty's Treasury. Key economic decisions are often taken here in great secrecy by a handful of civil servants and Treasury ministers. Tony Benn argued in Cabinet that this secrecy was being used to prevent Parliament from having a say in what was being decided.
In the case of budget statements, which are withheld from the Cabinet, people never believe that Cabinets don't discuss the budget, but they do not. If there is a reference in the budget speech to a particular departmental interest, a short extract will be sent to the minister, or may be sent to the minister concerned to look at.
Can you imagine having a discussion amongst 10, 12 people or more, with papers being circulated for such a meeting to discuss whether the pound should go up or down, or whether interest rates should go up or down? It is totally impossible to decide issues of that description in that way, because no sooner would you make a recommendation that the pound should go up, that it would go up because of the policies you are advocating, or somebody would try to pressurize it down. I mean, you can't have discussions of such sensitive issues amongst a large group of people.
But what is extraordinary and very vivid in the case of the budget is that civil servants in the Treasury go through the whole budget speech and discuss it with the Chancellor, but ministers only hear 24 hours beforehand what the Chancellor is going to discuss. There is no collective cabinet discussion about the shape of the budget, and yet the budget is one of the central decisions taken by any government in any year.
But of course, if a cabinet minister feels that the economic policy and a policy in relation to the pound or interest rates is so wrong that he wants it discussed in cabinet, it would be open to him to try and raise it in cabinet. I'm bound to say it wouldn't be easy. Prime ministers set the agenda for cabinet and don't lightly allow even senior ministers to change that agenda.
Not content with noting every conversation, filing every speech and saving papers and press cuttings, Tony Benn was also making movies, and he took his camera to the Cabinet. When this was filmed, disagreement among Benn's ministerial colleagues was reaching its height.
And in the summer of '77, I took my home movie camera to Chequers. And looking back on it now, it's so interesting because we were discussing the Lib Lab Pact. And actually in the Cabinet were several people who later joined the SDP. There's David Owen. Since then he's been in 3 political parties. He was then our Foreign Secretary, SDP. We had within the Cabinet several people who were preparing. There's Shirley Williams, there's Tom McNally, who was the Prime Minister's principal advisor at Number 10. There's Sonny Jim, Uncle Jim, Prime Minister. And in that cabinet was the core of the SDP, and we were discussing relations with the Liberals. And one of the things that's interesting, of course, about that home movie is that it is the only picture, movie picture, or probably still picture, ever taken of the cabinet actually meeting at Chequers, which it does quite regularly under every government.
Tony Benn believes that the presence of American bases and nuclear weapons in this country is also a threat to democracy. As minister in charge of nuclear power, he was constantly obliged to seek permissions from the Americans. His experiences at that time led him to think that Britain is little more than a colony.
As Minister of Technology between 1966 and 1970, I was the cabinet minister responsible for the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment at Aldermaston. In 1969, I took over responsibility for the Ministry of Supply, which, as it happened, had the technical job of vetting people across the whole of Whitehall, so I read some security files. Not a major role in security, but a significant one. Therefore, I was, in a sense, during that period, and to some extent later, Secretary of State for Energy, I was the British end of the special relationship between Britain and the United States.
The central fact about the relationship with the Americans is both the intelligence connection, whereby we have special access to American intelligence material not available to the rest of the NATO, and also the nuclear relationship, and both of those go back to the Second World War. And because, of course, we want to keep or the British establishment feels that it wants to keep the intelligence links with the Americans, and also, as long as we want to have what we describe as an independent deterrent that is, in fact, largely dependent on American material and technology, then a certain price has to be paid for that.
I realized that I, as the minister, had to go to Washington to get permission to do what I wanted to do. Let me give 3 examples. First of all, the example of taking British nuclear fuels out of the Atomic Energy Authority and making it into a separate company. I had to explain to Glenn Seaborg, who was the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission in the United States, exactly how this would work and that it would still be covered by the Official Secrets Act. Another example was when the centrifuge was developed and we were dependent upon an American end cap for the centrifuge, a piece of mechanical engineering, not very complicated. I had to go and get permission from Washington for that to be undertaken and used for our centrifuge. And thirdly, of course, in the whole area of strategic embargoes for supplying equipment to Eastern Europe, the Americans had a veto on any of their equipment. And I think they used it partly for strategic reasons, but partly for reasons of commercial competitiveness. They did not want the British to get in and sell equipment to Eastern Europe at a time when they themselves, under their own strategic embargo, were prevented from selling similar equipment. And they wanted to wait till they had a chance and hold us back until then.
Tony Benn was also in constant conflict with the civil service. Crisis point was reached in February 1977, when industrial action brought the Windscale nuclear power station to a halt.
The civil servant advisor had said that unless the dispute was solved very quickly, then Windscale would become unsafe. And that there were certain vital supplies that were absolutely necessary to get in to keep Windscale safe. Safe in the sort of nuclear sense, it would become a health risk. And they therefore argued that the army should, as it were, smash through the picket lines with the vital supplies. Obviously, this put Tony Benn, as Secretary of State, in a very difficult position. And I remember quite clearly him sitting with him in his office, and he said, well, at least I am going to go and see for myself whether it is not possible to resolve this dispute. And so, therefore, within kind of half an hour, we were all on a plane to Windscale.
It was critical in the dispute and quite frightening. It's not often that 6 people find themselves huddled on an executive jet plane flying into what they believe is going to be a nuclear explosion. But we discovered when we got up there and when Tony Benn started questioning the nuclear inspectorate that the threat wasn't as real as had originally been said, and that there were a number of backup systems. And when we got there, the management began to run scared because it was explained to them very patiently by Tony Benn that if he did bust this strike by using troops and guns, the general public would not be very enamoured of the nuclear industry, and they'd wonder what would happen in the future if the strikers became angry and actually a fight broke out between the strikers and the army. I mean, this is not a clever way to say we've got an industry that is so volatile that we can only solve our industrial relations problems by using troops.
At the very end of the Windscale strike, Sir John Hill came to see me. We were up there. 14th of March, my diary shows, 1977. And I quote the diary entry written that night. Then I said, what are the real hazards here? He said, that's John Hill, well, there's activity everywhere you dig on that site. Because don't forget that Windscale started as a weapons site, and we would be pushed, and I'm quoting Hill, to produce 20 kilograms of plutonium before the Russians marched on Berlin. It was given top priority. Whenever we had a spill, we just covered it up. For example, and I'm still quoting Hill, in 1957, one of the reactors caught fire, and we simply poured 300,000 tons of water through it, and it went right through into the ground. You can't dig anywhere without the soil producing radioactive responses. He said the plant itself was built to 2 standards of containment. There were the double-clad, no-leak tanks, and there was the low-activity waste. There was always some seepage from all of it, but there were inspection checks. Now, that was his comment at the end of a very dramatic incident in the atmosphere of relaxation that follows a moment of high drama. But it told me something about, first of all, the linkage between the military and the civil, which has always been there, and also something about the safety factor, which the industry was very reluctant to let known for fear that it would damage the industry and damage the prospects for that industry to survive and for the planning application to come forward that would allow the Windscale plant to be developed.
Growing public concern about nuclear power was seen at the Sizewell inquiry, which began in January 1983 and lasted for 340 days. It cost £20 million. Tony Benn testified against the proposed nuclear station.
And it took me many, many years to realize that, in fact, it was not peaceful, nor cheap, nor safe. That really the initiative for producing the original nuclear power was military, that the civil program was needed to produce the plutonium. And the final straw came after I left office, when I discovered what I'd never been told when I was there, that under an agreement with the United States, plutonium from our civil power stations had been sent to America for their military weapons program. And that really the civil power stations, which were called peaceful, were bomb factories for the United States. And this was put to me. I used it in giving evidence at the Sizewell inquiry, having learned it from Dr. Hesketh, who was sacked by the generating board for writing to the Times saying this. I was cross-examined and asked many times to withdraw that statement that I've just made. I refused to withdraw it, and afterwards ministers admitted that in fact the plutonium had been going during the period I was there, and I feel totally and absolutely betrayed that throughout this period I was allowed to make speeches about peaceful atomic power, nuclear power, atoms for peace, when actually we were building up the nuclear stockpile of the United States for military purposes.
The 1931 Labour cabinet. Tony Benn's father was a member of Ramsay MacDonald's government, which was brought down by an international economic crisis when Labour was forced to cut public spending.
Mr. Wedgwood Benn, he is one of the young men. He is having...
In 1976, when Labour again faced international economic pressures, Benn remembered his father's experience and circulated the 1931 cabinet minutes to warn his colleagues.
And that night, having made notes of what happened, I would record in my diary what had occurred in that particular day. And that is therefore, this record is therefore contemporary, but not, of course, recorded at the cabinet, but dictated by me on the basis of the cabinet proceedings that day. I said,
There is an eerie parallel with 1931. And Jim interrupted and said, there is no such parallel. I don't accept it. I've read all the minutes you've been circulating, every one of them, and I don't accept it. Well, I said, I'm very sorry, but if I'm a member of Cabinet, I must say what I think. And I think there is a parallel with 1931, because then, too, the loan hinged upon the cutting of the benefits.
The importance of these minutes and the interest of them lies in many things, one of which is that at the beginning the Cabinet was told it was so secret they couldn't take their papers with them. The minutes then revealed that the French bankers, the American bankers, the Tories and the Liberals were consulted, and at the end, the day before Ramsay MacDonald resigned to form a coalition government, he said, and I'm quoting the Cabinet minutes, "In conclusion, the Prime Minister said that it must be admitted that the proposals as a whole, they were the ones he'd put forward, represented the negation of everything the Labour Party stood for, and yet he was absolutely satisfied that it was necessary in the national interests to implement them if the country was to be secured." He then pointed out that if on this question there were any important resignations, the government as a whole must resign. And as there was opposition, the following day he resigned, having previously arranged to enter into a coalition with the Liberals and the Tories at the invitation of the King. Callaghan was furious because he was not anxious to be compared to Ramsay MacDonald. But they were very effective in one respect, and never forget we won one little victory in 1976. There was a proposal that in addition to the public expenditure cuts, we would cut the benefits. And that was the thing that brought the 31 government down. And when these minutes were circulated and the warning was given, the shot was fired across their bows, they didn't cut the benefits. I've been in Parliament for 38 years, 11 years in the Cabinet, and of course, as this programme will have shown, I've learned what the obstacles are. And when I compare the problems we have with the problems that faced Keir Hardie, whose chair I'm sitting in, this belonged to him and it was given to me by one of his descendants, I realise that we've built an enormous structure of popular power which could be used to give people jobs and homes and schools and decent pensions. The trouble with the Labour movement is that when it faces the old feudal system, it accepts it, bows down before it, tugs its forelock, it collaborates with its own defeat. So the whole purpose of my own life and experience and the purpose of the programmes, in a way, is to show people the obstacles and then to show they're all paper tigers, as they are.
One day, the Benn papers will be donated to one of our national archives and open to the public. In the meantime, Tony Benn continues to add to his daily record of contemporary political life.